All right, good morning. Today we're going to learn how to do a couple of new things in Flash. We're going to continue with our use of motion guides, and we're going to try and continue improving our use of keyframes and understanding how we can use keyframes to adjust an object along a motion guide. So it sounds like a lot, but it's actually relatively simple. The other thing that we're going to do today is we're going to make a little bit more complex scenes. So it's going to require us to work with multiple layers over here on the left side. And with that said, here we go. So today we're going to try and make an airplane, and we're going to have that airplane fly from one side of our screen to the next. I'm going to start by drawing my airplane. So I'm going to name my layer airplane so that I know exactly where that is. And I actually tried to save a little bit of time on this video by drawing a plane in advance. So in my library, I can find any object, right, that I want. In fact, if I wanted to right now, I could have, if I had a new layer, I could go ahead and I could draw anything I wanted. In this case, it'll be a rectangle, right, that's blue. Maybe I'll give it a different stroke color. I can draw it, convert it to a symbol. I'll call it blue square and hit OK. And now you can see that blue square is here in my library. If I decided I didn't want my blue square on my stage, I could delete it. But anytime I wanted to bring it back, I just go to my library, grab my blue square, and drag it right onto the screen. Same is true with my airplane, and same is true with this tree that I've drawn. In any case, I'm going to delete that layer for now. Okay, so I have my airplane, and I'm going to need a few things here for this to be like a relatively, it can still be a cartoon, as you can tell from my drawing, but I want it to represent a realistic scene. So I'm going to get my free transform tool, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shrink my plane down a little bit so it fits well on my screen, and I'm going to adjust it so that it's facing this direction. I want it to fly from left to right. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set my plane aside, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw the background. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to insert a layer, and I'm going to draw the sky. All right? And I really want to make sure I'm selected on this layer, on the sky layer. I'm going to go over here to my, to get the rectangle tool, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to choose no stroke color. I'm going to choose a color for my sky. In this case, I'm going to choose like this light blue, and I'm just going to set it up so it's just outside the stage on both sides. That way you won't see any white from the original stage. Okay? So now I've got my sky drawn, and I've got my airplane, but you can't see my airplane because it's below the sky layer. You always want to set the layers in your background from what you want farthest at the back to what you want in the front. All right? So now that I've drawn the sky, I'm going to insert another layer. I'm going to call these my runways. Okay? On this layer, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw a runway. So I'm going to use the rectangle tool again. This time I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use a black stroke color and a black fill color for my runway. I want to make sure I'm selected on that layer. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to have a nice little runway here. And I can actually click on that keyframe, copy it, and paste it. And then I'll be able to have that same runway over here. Okay? It's easier to if I want, now that I've got those set up, and I might even choose to move this one over again. I use the arrow tool on my keyboard to do that. If I wanted to make some adjustments to those, I could hide my sky for a second, grab my free transform tool, highlight one of these, and I could rotate it slightly. Again, that's entirely up to you, and I'm sure that many of you guys will come up with some creative ideas to make this look really good. So I'm going to move this up just a tiny bit, okay, so it looks good to me. And I want to add a little bit more character to my runway. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab my pencil tool. Actually, I'll grab my line tool. I'm going to change the stroke color to yellow. Choose this yellow right here. And I'll go to my properties menu and just change it, the stroke height to 6. See how that looks. I'm just going to set myself up. I'm going to give myself a couple of little yellow lines. We're familiar with, like most roads would have, like that dotted line. I don't think there's going to be 2 planes going on the runway at the same time. Hopefully not, and hopefully definitely not in different directions. But nothing else, it just adds like a little creativity. You could use some of the skills you know already and have like some blinking lights here. But we can get a little bit more complex later. So now I've got my sky and my runways, but it's still looking pretty empty. So the next thing I'm going to do is I want to insert a layer, and this layer I'm going to call like my hills. What I do is I want to draw some hills on the hills layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use my rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw a couple of rectangles. I'm going to draw one here. I'm going to draw one here. You'll see why in a second. And then I'm going to draw one kind of like right there. The reason I drew 3 rectangles for my hills was that now watch, I can use my selection tool and I can go ahead and make them look like little mountains. Now it looks a little strange right here, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stretch that out. Stretch this out. Okay? And now I've got a nice like little background. I'm still not really totally happy. I think it could be a little bit more thorough. And you can see here on my layers, I need to move my hills below my runways so that you can see that. But I'd like to still add like a little bit more here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add another layer. Okay? And I'm going to call this my lake layer. And I'm just going to grab my pencil tool. I'm going to grab a color for my lake. So you can see that there's like a lot of options for how you can add some creativity to your animations. Just going to fill that in. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go back to my library. And you can see I brought my tree over from a different animation that I created. I'm going to insert a layer. I'm going to call this my tree layer. And I won't put too many in right now. I'm just going to put one in. That's a huge tree, so I'm going to shrink it down with my free transform tool. And like trees like to grow around lakes, so let's. Notice I just copied, pasted. I'm just hitting Control C, right, and then Control V. And then actually, once I've done it one time, I can just hit Control V each time. And I won't make you sit here and suffer through this, but you can get an idea of like how something like this might work. Okay? So the next step is I'm ready to make my airplane move. So just like our other assignments, right? I just want to clean up a couple of things here, like this runway. It doesn't quite go to the edge. Actually, we'll leave it for now. Let's just move on. So I'm going to move my airplane down here onto my runway. Okay. Notice my layers. Airplane's on the top, the runway's right below it. Okay. Then I've got my trees, my lake, my hills, and the sky in the very background. That's why it all looks like this. My airplane looks a little bit big, so I'm just going to go ahead and grab my free transform tool again. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. Remember to draw it large, and then you can always shrink it down. Okay? Now I need a motion guide for it to follow, so I'm going to say add a classic motion guide. And as part of this assignment, right, your plane needs to take off. It needs to be in flight do a flip in the air, and then it has to land safely on the other runway. So on my guide layer, I'm going to grab my pencil tool. Okay. I'm going to make sure, I'm going to change my pencil stroke to something a little bit smaller, like 4. And I want to make the stroke color a color that's going to be easy to show up. So in this case, there's nothing red on my drawing. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to add a red stroke color. Okay. On my guide layer, I'm going to draw the pathway for my airplane to follow. So I'm going to have it go down the runway, right? And then it's going to take off. Going to level out just for a second. And I'm going to have it go into like a really steep loop. It's going to come almost straight down towards the lake, fly right over the lake, and then land. Notice I did that all in one stroke for that loop. Okay, so now I've got my guide layer, and I just need to decide how long this animation is going to be. Remember, the shorter it is, the faster your plane's going to go. The longer it is, right, the slower it'll go. I'm going to go ahead on keyframe 100. I'm going to insert a frame only. So at 100 on my timeline, I'm going to insert a frame. That's going to hold everything up there. Okay, I don't want anything disappearing right now. Okay, the only layer that needs a keyframe is the airplane layer. That's the only thing that's moving. So I'm going to go ahead on my airplane layer. I'm going to say create classic tween. You can see it snaps to the line. Okay, I'm going to go to 100. I'm going to insert a keyframe there. And I'm going to move the airplane from one side of the line to the other. Okay, so that's great. The only problem is that as it goes around the loop, it's going backwards. And that doesn't really happen too often. So that's where we're going to work along our keyframe or along our motion guide, okay? And we're going to make it look a little more realistic. So as I go along, I can see my plane flying. Now right here, it should probably be facing up as it heads towards the sky and takes off. So watch what I can do. I can just right click on the motion or on the classic tween that I have. I'm going to say insert a keyframe. I'm going to grab my free transform tool and I'm going to rotate it up to follow the line. Okay, I'm going to let it keep going up, and maybe 5 keyframes later, I'll insert another keyframe. This doesn't have to be exactly perfect, right? But you do want it to like follow that path. So now it's going up, it's looking good. Right about here, it should start to level off. Okay, so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a keyframe here and make sure it keeps going up. And then right here, insert a keyframe and rotate it to follow the line. Again, you pretty much want the nose of the airplane to always be following that line. So if you notice that it's not, just all you have to do is insert a keyframe and rotate the plane up. Okay? And then insert a keyframe and rotate the plane up. Now I know that this tutorial is getting a little bit lengthy, so I'm going to try and move quick, but I want you to really understand what I'm doing here. Okay, so every time I want it to rotate, I'm just right-clicking on my timeline, and sometimes they're going to be closer than others, and I need to rotate my airplane so that it follows the line. Okay, if you don't insert enough keyframes, then your plane's not going to look as realistic as it possibly could. Okay, and you can see it'll start to sputter out and face a strange direction based on where it starts and ends. Insert a keyframe, rotate down. I'm going to follow it along the timeline. I'm going to insert another keyframe, again, just to make sure that it's following the guide that I set for it. I'm getting close to the bottom, insert a keyframe again, rotate it. All I'm doing is I'm just following that motion guide. Okay, and now, as it gets pretty close to the runway, we want to make sure most planes like flare just a little bit right before they land. So I'm going to have it kind of flare back. Make sure that looks all right. Might even do one more. And there we go. So now I just want to check, make sure it looks all right. I'm going to go to Control, Test Scene. Right? And again, still a cartoon type animation, but nonetheless, right, it follows a really nice flight pattern and it looks relatively realistic. Personally, I would probably add like a few more trees in here, make it a little more detailed, maybe put a little sun up here in the top. But for the time being, we'll leave it at that. Thanks.